What's going on, Sumolings? It's Chris from AppSumo, and I am super excited to share with you a conversation I had with a very special guest. So I sat down with Patrick Campbell, CEO of ProfitWell, where we dive deep into a wide variety of topics, including how to get creative with your business model, how to scale your content to look like a $100 million company, and why Patrick was determined to build a growth business, not a lifestyle one. We also talk about the challenges and opportunities of optimizing not just your content creation process, but also your content distribution model. We even get a sneak peek at what it's actually like to get recruited by the NSA. And if they're listening, because of course they're listening, I'm still waiting for my call. So if you're an entrepreneur who is interested in maximizing your business to its highest potential, then you definitely don't want to miss out on this interview. And if you stick around till the end, you'll even hear Patrick answer questions directly from the Sumolink community. Thank you, and please enjoy my conversation with Patrick Campbell. Thank you for joining us. You like it?
You're like my Flavor Flav right now.
Ooh, I should just follow you around before you go on stage.
There you go. That would be pretty cool to do that in tech. I don't know why someone hasn't done that in tech.
Well, so I heard when you were at the SaaS conference in Dublin, you guys blew it out of the water.
We did pretty well. Yeah.
What was that experience like?
Well, one thing that we're similar to you guys where we're a bootstrap company, which doesn't mean you're not trying to create a big company. It just means that you're trying to do it a little bit differently, and maybe you raise money, maybe you don't, depending on, the trajectory. But one big thing we think about, and the reason I bring that up, we think about leverage a lot. Like, how do we get the most out of this trip? How do we get the most out of this conference? And so what we ended up doing is we were like, oh, why don't we have our own stage, right? And the conference organizer, I don't think they realized how big of a presence it would have, but we pretty much had a stage next to this coffee bar that we put in. And then basically we held interviews, we held demos, we held all these types of things. And the nature of conferences is when one or two people start looking at you doing something, all of a sudden you get this big crowd. So we got into a situation where we for better and for worse overshadowed a few speakers, which wasn't our intention, but it was, we did really, really well with that conference, which we were excited about.
That's awesome. Well, that just goes to the power of the ProfitWell brand. I feel like I've been seeing you guys all over the place. Ullman, who's the head of business development at AppSumo, he's the one that told me about that because he was at that conference.
Yeah.
And he's like, you got to ask Patrick about, what went into that, because he's like, it made them look like a $100 million company with their branding, the way they had it set up.
Totally. Well, it really just comes down to the details. And I know that sounds so simple, but the details are terribly difficult, right? Mm-hmm. Because, we have an event team of one person for that conference.
Really?
And they're supported by our media team, which has a creative producer and then a creative producer lead who helps with the graphics and everything like that. But we always have these conversations where they'll come to me and they'll be like, hey, this is the $70,000 idea. And normally the $70,000 idea is great, but it's not necessarily fantastic because not because it's, because it basically has more resource, right? And we're like, oh, well, I don't know, what could we do for 50? And normally that thought process, even if we still spend the $70,000, that thought process comes down to, oh, well, why don't we do this and why don't we do that? And then how do we rethink how we're supposed to bring people into the booth? And then all of a sudden we have this leverage and then we just execute it really, really well, right? And I think that was the big thing where, we had G2 Crowd there and they sponsor tons of conferences. And they all of a sudden will have this giant 2-story booth that's got a slide and everything. But it seems so corporate and no one's going there because, and they do really well, don't get me wrong, but they're not necessarily thinking through the fundamentals of what you're trying to do at a conference, which is bring people into the booth to have those conversations and not just get a lead scan, but get that branding, get that washed over with those leads.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's always one of the case studies that I've read about in certain books where they talk about, man, that guy that stormed the Olympics and jumped in the pool and he had some brand on it. Oh, yeah. It was it was all over the news, but nobody knew what the brand was because what he was doing wasn't core to the business. So you can have a slide at your booth and everybody remembers there was a slide at a booth, but they don't know which booth it was.
But I think it's about having, there's probably a spectrum and you kind of, just kind of alluded to it, right? Which is ridiculousness and loud, boring and effective, and it trying to find somewhere in between because you want to be memorable. And we get a lot of people because we serve, we are a subscription SaaS company and we serve other subscription companies, right? So we get a lot of oh, that's cool, I should steal that idea, which is we're fine with because we're not competing with them or anything like that. But it's one of those things where we get a lot of that oh, we're punching above our weight class type of mentality, which I think helps us with our brand.
So how do you think through those ideas? Because I see you guys as a very creative company. I think like what you ended up doing with ProfitWell, making it that freemium model that you ended up going with, was like a very creative twist on what you guys were trying to do. And we can go into that a little bit later, but similar to this conference, like, do you guys have a playbook for creativity or for brainstorming or idea generation?
Yeah, I wish, I want to be really practical to folks who are listening or watching. So, it's one of those things where I want to say like, do A plus B equals C and like do that. But I think what it really comes down to is understanding those constraints and then really teaching about leverage. So the thing that a lot of us don't learn about when we're in school because we didn't really need to is basically critical thinking, right? Unless you're an engineer who's been faced with some of those problems in a computer science course, you read papers, you read books, you regurgitated stuff about those books, like those types of things. And there's that knowledge is valuable. But the real valuable knowledge is like, hey, we have this problem. What are the causes of the problem? Let's align the solutions to the causes, right? And that's a super basic statement, but there's a lot of work that goes into that. So when we look at things, it's really around that restriction is expression. And so what I mean by that is we have these constraints, and even if we had $100 million in the bank ready to spend, we would still practice these constraints because we always want to like win, and we always want to be really, really successful with what we do and the money that we spend. So the playbook really comes down to what is identifying what is the goal of what we're trying to do? At a conference, we're trying to get as many people, quality people at the booth as possible. Well, what that means, because it's a 3-day conference, we need as many different layers, right? Well, what can we do? Well, we can offer up they're not, giving away free coffee.
Layers by like different touch points?
Different things, right? Okay. So there's a bunch of different things that we can do to drive people to the booth. So the first thing was, well, they're not offering coffee like for free. That's really annoying. We can offer coffee for free. It's like cheap. It's like €3 a cup or €2 a cup or €1 a cup at scale. That's relatively inexpensive to have thousands of people to come hang out and literally wait in line. And the only thing they can do is talk to us while they're waiting in line, right? Then we can do that. Then we can have content in our booth, like interesting content that people can come to. We have this whole like key strategy where we give away all these like keys, and we have this lockbox where someone can come win, something, and that's driving people to the booth. And then there's just the natural like spectacle that drives people to the booth. And then there's like, you're thinking through all these layers. And so with ProfitWell, and for those of you who don't know, like we have a free product, plugs into your billing system. So Stripe, Braintree, Zora, whatever you're using, gives you free access to your MRR, your churn, all that kind of fun stuff. And then what we do is we make money we have a couple of different products that sits on top of that product, and basically helps reduce your churn or optimize your pricing or those types of things. And so it really came down to leverage. So we were thinking through, hey, we have this pricing product. That was our first product. And then we were like, okay, we wanted a better way to get the data that we were getting with our pricing software. We started thinking through that problem, and we were like, well, there's top of the funnel data that we can get. There's bottom of the funnel data. There's post funnel data. There's financial data. We need all of it, right? Well, where's the first place that we can go, or what's the data we're absolutely going to need? Well, the financial data. That's the data we absolutely are going to need, because it doesn't matter if I analyze your Google Analytics data, I need attribution somehow, right? And so it became like, all right, well, we could probably do something in the financial space. Then we were talking to one of our customers. They were about to IPO, and we discovered, like they're calculating their MRR and their churn completely incorrectly. And that's like monthly recurring revenue for the folks on here who aren't subscriptions. It's kind of like looking at your bank account and like getting the number completely wrong. It's like that basic of a number. So we're like, oh, interesting. There's this product. So we built the MVP. Then we discovered, this is a product that's terrible to sell. No one wants to pay for something like this. But there's a bunch of leverage in us getting this data and then using that data in our algorithms of our other software that we could potentially sell, right? And all of these things, they're not necessarily happening linearly, but we're like thinking through it. So we're thinking through, what is the cause, or what is the thing that we're trying to do, and what is the best way to do it? And then we did some research and just discovered, hey, this lowers our CAC, gives us a network effect of, helping our algorithms and all those types of things. And then ultimately what it does is it gives us some brand, and it gives us some reach and a network effect of like getting new users, right? So then it formed into this thesis of, hey, we're going to get all this data, and then that data we're going to use to build these cool products that automatically, help you grow, right? Yeah. And I know, again, that sounds hopefully coherent, but also like very, very like a small short missive, but that took, years, at least 2 years to like get that thesis into a good place. But it all came down to, what is the functional or leverage thing we're trying to do, and then evaluating what are all the options for us to do that, and then picking those options based on what they looked like.
Yeah. So it's like a simplified scientific method. It's like, what are we trying to solve?
100%.
What's our hypothesis? What can we invest?
Yeah. There's been a lot of like talk about frameworks recently, like the Farnham project. I can't remember the name, but that's that podcast. He came out with a book that was just like, hey, critical thinking frameworks, which like, again, we don't really think about. And this is, you joked, or didn't joke, but you mentioned like worked in the intelligence community. That's where I picked up on a lot of this stuff, which was like, hey, here are your constraints. Figure out how you maximize the thing you're trying to do. Because that's really all you're trying to do. And then you're using the scientific method theoretically to try to figure out what is the thing that's going to maximize the outcome you're trying to go after.
So how did you come in? Like, what was early career for Patrick? Like,
yeah, I didn't want to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Wasn't anything against it, but well, I grew up in a household that was very anti-business.
Interesting.
So I grew up in a union household. So my dad, he was a big union guy for his entire career. My brother now works for the union. He was a big union guy. So most of our arguments, or most of our conversations are arguments about like why unions are good and the management's terrible, even to this day. But that's a whole nother podcast, I'm sure. But basically, very classic blue collar, poor background. And then when you're poor and blue collar, the goal is for your kids to go be a doctor, right? And my brother, he wasn't going to be one of those. And so I was the kid that was smart, or that kind of smart. My brother's smart, but just different kind. And then like, oh, go be a doctor. Well, I hated blood. Then it was like, oh, go be a lawyer. Oh, there's more lawyers than there are jobs for lawyers. That sucks. And that's a lot of debt. And then I was, I'm a very patriotic person. So my dad's also, he was a reservist. He did a couple tours in Iraq. I didn't really want to join the military, but it was like, oh, I want to kind of save the world. Or I want to like give back. Right. And I got recruited to basically go work in the intelligence community. And it was one of those things where it was the most fulfilling job I've ever had, and probably one of the most fulfilling jobs I'll ever have, given any other jobs or careers that I have. But you're working for the government. And when you work for the government, giant bureaucracy, when you're a young, punk, ambitious kid who like wants to like do really, really well, really, really quickly, it's really hard to work for the government. And so I was involved in things that like to this day, I'm like very, very proud of, quote unquote, saving a life or preventing conflict or, getting us an advantage as the US in different situations. But it was one of those things where I wasn't like, hey, I'm going to be a career guy. I also like talking about my job. You can't talk about your job when you work there. Normally couples, they'll both work in the IC and I just don't know what they talk about because they both can't talk about their respective jobs. And so they end up having, I don't know what they talk
about.
But yeah. Hobbies, like who has those, right? And then so I left, I was like, oh, maybe I get into tech. I went to Google and I was thinking, oh, this won't be a bureaucracy because it's a tech company, right? Well, it's 30,000 people when I was there. Now it's 100,000 or above right now. And then basically I started off in sales there, but I now have this, background in econometrics and math, what I studied. And
you studied that in college?
Yeah, I studied that in college. Okay. Political economy and econometrics.
And where'd you go to school?
School called Bradley University. Okay. I say that because no one's probably heard of it.
Okay, where is it?
Central Illinois, Peoria, Illinois.
Right.
Caterpillar is capital, or their headquarters is there. It's basically directly between St. Louis and Chicago if you're driving down. Okay. But yeah, it was one of those things where I had that background. And so I started basically being a data scientist with my book of business as a salesperson. Made Google a ton of money because I rolled out these algorithms across a bunch of different teams. I did it in a very rogue way because they didn't want to support it. But then they wanted to shut the project down. And you're seeing a theme of hubris here. Basically what ended up happening is I was like, well, if I'm going to bust my butt, I might as well do it for myself. And then that's when I jumped into, thankfully, like I didn't do this intentionally, but I was naive enough to go work for someone else first. And I think that was the best decision that I, didn't really make, but like consciously made. Just because like if I would have started a company right out of Google, I would have failed miserably. And I worked for another startup and then, I was there for 9 months. You're seeing a theme here. Didn't really love the culture. Thought I could do better and then started ProfitWell about 8 years ago. We were then called Price Intelligently, but we've kind of evolved since there.
So going back a minute, how do you get recruited by the NSA? What is that? Because I've seen the recruit. I think that's the CIA.
I don't know.
What is that process like? Do they walk into a bar and they slip you a card, or what?
Yeah. Well, they don't try to find you at a bar. That's the one thing. So, no, it actually was like I was doing a bunch of internships in DC. And I worked for this think tank. Because what's interesting when you work for, it depends on the agency you work for, or try to work for. NSA is like, I always joke, it's like the nerds doing the jocks' homework and the jocks are the CIA. And the reason is because if you're not involved with, if you're not involved with the clandestine side of the CIA, the other side of the CIA is basically like they're writing book reports. That's really how it is. They're just looking at a bunch of different pieces of information from different agencies and consolidating them and then going to the State Department and things like that. I'm simplifying it majorly, but the NSA is very like, they hire like, a lot of the senior folks I worked with are just geniuses, like legit geniuses, like math geniuses, engineering geniuses, computer science geniuses, who have a patriotic bent and get paid pretty well by the government to come in and do fun problems. And so I had done a couple internships, and one of the internships I worked at was a I'm going to spin up some controversy here just
Please,
for fun.
let's do it.
So I worked at an agency called AEI, and I was a research intern for Newt Gingrich, actually. Okay. Which was, former Speaker of the House, very polarizing, especially when I was in a Union Clinton household. And so I remember on the actual interview being like, well, growing up, your name was synonymous with the devil. So I don't know what else to say, but but yeah, I mean, got a kick out of that. And that was a good job, but they have a big defense kind of side. And so basically I got, recruited on that side. And then the recruitment process is pretty intense. You go through full scale polygraph, and I can't go deeper into it, but it's a pretty long process. They look at and you can find this stuff online, but my neighbors from my childhood home got interviewed, all for just this entry level, position.
Was Patrick burning ants as a youth?
Oh no, they ask about your finances, because what's funny is if you have bad credit, you can't get a job there.
Oh wow.
Because you're theoretically, and it's all statistical.
You're vulnerable,
and you're vulnerable to being recruited by a foreign entity. And when I was there, the interns, those were the ones that had the the highest rate of investigation, because not because the interns were doing anything bad, but because people knew that they had an ephemeral job. They weren't necessarily going to be there a long time, so they might not have taken some of the things seriously. So yeah, it was again, one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done.
That's awesome.
But it was just
thank you for your service.
Yeah, well, I was a civilian side.
Okay,
so I don't know if that counts.
So don't thank you for
yeah. No, it's that's some people
Thanks for some of your service. Some of it was mediocre. All right.
You don't get a ton of credit. It's funny because you're working. So half your team is typically military, and the other half is non-military, and then the half that's non-military is typically LDS or Mormon, because of the language skills they get when they go on their missions. So it's always a really interesting mix of people. And the military folks, it's they should get all the credit on that type of things. But it's always funny when you're you're talking to, folks who even were on the intelligence side of the military. There's always a little bit of an extra pride stamp for them, mainly because they're military and they basically gave up a ton of pay, in order to still do the exact same job, which is super interesting. But
so some of the main things you got out of that though were learning how to identify problems, recognize constraints, and find leverage.
Totally. So I also went to the school I went to on a debate scholarship. So
yeah, that was another thing. Neil, who was prepping me for this, was saying he had background in speech and debate. So,
there's a little bit, there's a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that, because that was why I went to the school I went to, and it's kind of the glory days, if that makes sense. So I was writing speeches and doing argumentation for 40 hours a week for 4 years. And so
who were you writing speeches for?
Myself and our team.
Oh, okay.
It's too deep to go into. Anyone who's on the phone gets it, but basically I did what's called IEs. So you do 6 events, and a lot of those are platform speeches. So you're writing those and then competing on the weekends, and then there's nationals and all that kind of stuff. There's a couple of them that are more impromptu, those types of things. But yeah, our team, Bradley's, one of the top, 3 in the country every year. And so that's kind of what they're known for. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is good. But then that and, working at the NSA, it was a really good education in formalizing all that knowledge and making it applicable to business problems and just obviously, governmental problems when I was at NSA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. So,
it's a good time.
So fast forwarding post Google, you were working for another startup where you said you kind of learned a lot of lessons that set you up for when you were eventually going to become the entrepreneur you became. What was that like?
So there's a thing you realize. So NSA, really smart people or really dedicated people or a mix of everything in between. Because you're working for the government, you're trying to save the world, on a number of levels. Google, you're basically a blank, I like to say. You're just a really you're a smart person, and normally that's why you're surrounded by Harvard kids everywhere, right? Ivy League kids, right? Not so much anymore because they need to hire a ton of people, but I had a lot of imposter syndrome because I was the only kid from a non-Ivy League school in my class that I went into in Boston. But the problem is or not the problem, but the cool thing is everyone's super smart and they're slinging ads, right? And so there's this weird dichotomy that happens there. What you realize when you go to a company is not everyone is the smartest or brightest bulb, right? Not in a bad way. There's different skills, but that was a really good realization of there's different types of skills for different types of problems, and just being really book smart doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be really good, right? Because there were some folks, like, this is why I asked if you're a Northeastern kid, because you know Neil, because we love Northeastern folks because they've had co-ops. They're very, very practical about their knowledge, and they just like go running. It's kind of like if you had like if you're interning at startups throughout, your college career, that's a really good person to hire because they get it, right? Yeah. Whereas like if you threw a Harvard kid out there, and I'm generalizing like terribly, but if you threw a Harvard kid out there, it's like, there's a higher probability that they're really smart, but they're not as practical, right? And so that was a really big realization. And the other realization was just kind of like, culture is like super important. I know it's one of those things that like, and even then I didn't really believe it, but that's kind of where I learned this, where everyone's like, oh yeah, culture and people, those are the things that are going to hold you back to scaling and to growing, even if you're, a small business, right? And in reality, it's like, that's 100% right, but you don't realize that in the early days. You're like, nah, it'll be the product, it'll be the marketing, it'll be the other things.
You don't realize it until it either like goes wrong or goes really right.
Yeah. And so that was a big thing. And I think more practically, that's where, so I was kind of like a special projects person, and I was thrown on figuring out pricing. And so the company that I was at was called Gemvara, which is like a D2C company before D2C was a thing. And they did basically customized jewelry, kind of like Blue Nile.
Okay.
So, but their whole thing was gemstones, because theoretically, you buy more gemstone jewelry in your life than you buy diamond jewelry, right? And so there were like 1.6 million different SKUs to price, right? Because of all the permutations of customization. And they were like, hey, you're a pseudo entry level kid. They didn't say it like this. Pseudo entry level kid, here's this problem, right? And the problem is that it's a really big problem, and it has high impact because pricing, is a pretty big thing. So we'd adjust prices and like revenue would go like this, or revenue would go down, right? And all of a sudden that's what started the thesis of like, oh, there's like probably something here in helping people with pricing, because everyone knows that it's pretty important. No one knows what they're doing, and it actually like has a pretty high impact on a business. And at the end of 9 months, like the other thing I learned is kind of really applicable is that, the CEO founder didn't have jewelry experience or technical experience. And this was a product that was in jewelry, and the customization was a big technical problem. So he had to surround himself with a bunch of like SVPs and VPs that were, 20, 30 years of experience. Problem there is like they bring all their baggage and all this politics, right? So it was just kind of a good example of like finding, the right people, and like really thinking about what are the important things that the culture, the DNA of the company you're trying to build really has. But at the end of the 9 months, I was like, if I'm going to do this, start my own thing, like now's the time. No kids, no big debt, thankfully, like nothing like that. It just made sense to jump out.
So were you able to solve the problem for pricing within that company, and then that's what you leveraged? Or?
No, not really. Okay. So I started learning about it, and I was already kind of like not enamored. And I was going through some like big changes in my own life as well. I think like I was kind of going through the like, I don't know, quarter life crisis is the right word, but there's anyone who's in their late 20s realizes there's a difference between your early 20s and your late 20s.
I'm 29, coming up on my 30th birthday, and it's a whole thing.
No, but like in your early 20s, you're like, everything's going to be like this forever, right? Yeah. And it's like, you realize, oh, that's not how it is. And so I was kind of going through that transition from early 20s to late 20s, or like I was like 25 basically, so like right in there. But it was one of those things where I was like, oh, like it's time to like do something. And so I didn't really solve the complete problem there, but it was one of those things where I was ready to go. Yeah. And so jumped out, and there was a couple of other folks in Boston who were thinking about this problem. So we co-founded the company in the worst ways possible, because they were going to be part-time. I was going to be full-time. We never set expectations correctly. The paperwork was a mess, like all these really terrible first-time founder mistakes that thankfully we've kind of solved over the past, 8 years. But it was definitely like a classic terrible founding story. But they were also kind of interested, and then, we just, started going, and thankfully like started being successful. And like most of the time when there's success, it kind of solves some of those problems. Thankfully, if that makes sense.
What were some of the resources you relied on early on? Like, were there certain other companies' founders, any books that were particularly impactful?
So a couple things. One, so if I back up a second, I think one of the most successful things was, and this is all post hoc rationalization. So like maybe maybe this isn't true.
You write your own story.
Yeah, you kind of write your own story, and like, I mean, with hindsight, it helps you, but it also solidifies maybe things that weren't exactly like perfect at the time. I think there's this one guy in Boston, and in Boston at the time in like 2012, Boston's been around for a long time, obviously, but the tech community there has been, it's been around for a long time, and it's consistently number 2 to Silicon Valley for like funding and things like that. People don't give Boston enough credit because New York's a bigger city, London's a bigger city, and so they think like, oh, it's New York and London. Really, Boston's been kicking their butt for a long time. But in 2012, there was a little bit of this like revitalization of the Boston tech world because all the old school thinking of EMC and some of the other big companies out there, which was, hey, we have secrets, we keep them, we don't share with anyone because we don't want anyone else to learn. Those were all falling apart. So the community at that point and the CEO that I worked for, as well as a bunch of other CEOs in town, they started making about, no, let's help each other. Let's pay it forward. Let's share everything. Let's do that. And so that was super helpful starting a company then, because all of a sudden you had a bunch of like intros. Like I got intro to like Dharmesh and Brian Halligan. And like, yeah, they weren't a public company then, but it was like, they were definitely on that track still. Right. But this guy named Dave Bolter was probably, one of the single best like folks to really help. And his wife, and they weren't together at the time, but his wife, Sarah Hodges, they introduced me to these 2 other guys. Dave sat down with me and helped me so many times. He challenged so much of my thinking. Hodges did the same thing, introduced me to a ton of folks. So like those 2 people were hugely instrumental. And then like my co-founders in hindsight were super helpful as well. Like C-Todd or Christopher O'Donnell is the CPO of HubSpot. We got a free HubSpot account, which helped a lot. Helped a lot. And don't tell anyone, but it's still free, which is great. And then there was, I think from a book standpoint, I don't know, like books are, I think books are super useful, but they got to hit you at the right time.
100%.
So in hindsight, one of the best books that I read this now every year, sometimes twice a year, is High Output Management by Andy Grove.
Okay.
It teaches a lot of stuff that we just like we're talking about with like leverage. It's like thinking and chunking up the problem. And for anyone listening who's going to read it, the first chapter is one of the most boring book chapters I've ever read in my life. But I promise you there's a payoff, with the boringness of it. Yeah. He basically breaks down, like if you're a restaurant that serves an egg toasted coffee, like what are all the things that go into that? How do you optimize that as a business? And he goes through like quality assurance and all these, and you're just like, can you please stop talking about eggs at this point? It's a long chapter, but that book was really good. I don't know. I think those are some big things, but I think that also like I fortunately early on found a couple of like, folks I kind of consider more my co-founders than anything, to come on board, like our CPO Facundo, our kind of head of revenue, Peter. And these were folks that like, what did Bob Iger used to say or still says, that the measure of like a really good like CEO is someone who can find people who could be their own CEOs and still stick around. Like these guys could both be CEOs elsewhere. And they were really good about like sanding me down, and I was sanding them down about like all our rough edges, like trying to figure out, and we're still, working on a lot of that stuff. But and I got lucky. That was not like a very conscious thing. And so I think you got to find the right partner. Being a solopreneur, which is essentially what I was in the early days, it's real lonely. And you're not going to be able to scale a company that way at all.
So it seems like a lot of this early success was driven by all of these connections you were able to make. So what was like, do you have a strategy for the term networking that nobody likes, but like, how did you go about it? How did you approach it? How, like, especially when you're younger and you're like, I don't know if I have a whole ton of value that I can provide somebody, but I think they could provide a ton of value to me. How do you make that connection?
I think what really comes down to is, you have to take every meeting. And I think people, they try to game this too much, and they're like, well, I just want to make sure I take the right meeting. And as you get like higher contact volume and more surface area of a business, you do have to be a little bit choosy sometimes. But I think that early on, I basically like got out of the office as much as humanly possible. Like, and then like I would talk to them, and then normally what'll happen is if you're not a complete ass, like they'll be like, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. Like, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. And then you just follow these trees of people. And I still do this. Like people like, I've always gotten like, I'll tweet something about, meeting people, and like, they're like, well, you can't waste your time. You can't waste your time. I'm like, well, I don't know. Like I've seen that, yes, like, 30% of my meetings might be a waste of time. 30% of the meeting are like making or breaking the company. And like 40% of them are like going to pay off at some point. Right. Like there was this deal that came in recently. So on the price intelligence side, we sell a product that's like $150,000 to $300,000 a year. And then our other products are very like pure based on performance. So, you have $50 customers all the way up to people paying tens of thousands of dollars a month. And so, but recently one of our price intelligence deals that came in was a woman who at the time, her company was basically the same as mine, solopreneur. like we were just trying to like grind it out. I was nice to her. I gave him some like an intro or two. She gave me an intro or two. And then just over time, like that paid off. Like we haven't talked in 4 years, but she was like, oh, I need pricing. Oh, I got to go to Price Intelligently and ProfitWell, right? Wow. And so there's just stuff that happens like that. And I'm not a big like, emotional karma like kind of guy, but I think it's one of those things that this stuff does pay off. And if you give back to the community, it gives it back to you. And so you just have to take every meeting, and then you can choose. Like I have a slot on my calendar that's like, I get tons of startups that want pricing help. And I get all these emails, and sometimes it takes me a long time to get back to them. Sometimes I forward them to someone else and be like, hey, I don't really have time right now, but here's the right person to talk to. But I still have a block every single month where I just fill it with all those meetings.
That's awesome.
And like, again, I'm helpful. I probably will never get anything from most of those, but at least they're like, oh yeah, these are some cool guys. And when they think about it, like they'll intro someone or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think Naval Ravikant talks about like basically like the engine that you can put behind your own luck, where it's like you're going out and you're doing these things and they might not pay off, but then one person gets a $200,000 subscription management thing.
Totally.
And and you're just putting yourself out there to be that node in a network that connects and we'll
just make as many nodes as possible. And like, there's a lot of people, like there's different strategies for different folks, right? There's like a quality quotient. I think you need to be really careful about like your inner five, like the five like groups or friends or mentors or whatever. But you have to give some time to the rest of it. And sometimes you're not going to be able to do that all the time. Like there are quarters or, half years in our trajectory where I had to buckle down, with, some of the stuff that's going on with, coronavirus and all that kind of stuff. There might be a situation where like that's all shut down, and that's fine. Like you can still get on the phone with people. You can still do this type of stuff. And the secret becomes just like bifurcating it off and being very conscious of how much time you're doing, because you don't want it to be your core job, because then you get away from like working on the business.
Yeah. As you were growing Price Intelligently, it seems like early on your strategy was like, we want this to be like a growth oriented, scalable business. We don't want this to be a lifestyle business.
Yeah.
What was behind that decision? Like, why did you do that as opposed to like, hey, I want to make $500,000 a year running this company and not have to be stressed out or do anything like that?
Yeah. I think what's interesting is like, your DNA, like not your actual DNA, but the DNA of what you want and how you think and what is important to you is so crucial when you're building a business. And I think that too many times we try to judge other people's DNAs. Like, I think that too many times we look at the person doing, the $1 million a year, to just him or her, as like, oh, they're not building a real business. It's just a lifestyle business, right? And then we look at the person who like wants to work 80 hours a week and like this is their life and they want to build something great, whether it's $5 million, $100 million or whatever it is. And we judge them and we like tweet and write books and, like CC DHH and everything. Right. And I think it's like, neither of these are bad. Like neither of these are good. It's just like, it's what's for you. And for me, I thought I wanted the $500,000 a year. Right. Because I was like, poor, background. And I was like, oh, it'd be amazing to make $100,000.
Is that the number you had in your head? Because I feel like a lot of people, when you're coming up, you're like, if I could make this much or have this much in the bank, like I would feel.
I think for me, it was, I wanted to be a millionaire. And like making six figures very quickly would be exciting. Right. Now, I didn't even know what those numbers meant. Like,
it's just a number.
Yeah, because like when I was at Google, it was like, oh, if I stayed there a few years, I'd make six figures really quickly, right? And like, and I think that's where at Google, it was like, that was the safe bet. And what was really interesting, this guy named Jay Acunzo, who's kind of active in the world here about content, he kind of like, he really crystallized it for me. And he was like, okay, people at Google, they stay there for like 18 months to 2 years, or they leave after 7. Like there's no in between, because you get caught on the golden treadmill, and the golden treadmill is amazing. Don't get me wrong. There's people who they want to put in their 40, 45. They want a really good lifestyle and they want to go home to their white picket fence. It took me realizing that wasn't in my DNA. Then starting the company, I fell in love with like trying to solve the problem. Like it took me back to like the econ and like math days of like, I want to solve that problem. And now the problems are really big. And now I have control over those problems, and I have control over, do we go after this problem? Do we go after that problem? Right. And that was really, really exciting to me. And I started falling in love with like, I want to build, and I want to build a big business. Right. And I couldn't tell you like, why is it? Do I want to save the world? Do I want to invest in this? Do I want to invest in this? It's like, no, like it's kind of like, there just is the build. There just is the scale, right? There just is getting the leverage and like building. That's all I think of. Right. And so I think it's one of those things. And, I want to be at least one of those like people in our ecosystem that's like unapologetic of, no, I'm totally fine working 60, 80 hours. I'm not going to put that on someone else, and I'm not going to expect that out of someone. But if they want to do that too with me, like I'm not going to hold them back. Right. And that means that, yeah, there's some sacrifices and there's some trade-offs that I'm making. I don't have a hobby. Like I probably don't like spend as much time with my better half than I should. Yeah. Thankfully I don't have kids, or not thankfully, but like I don't have kids yet. So like, it's not like I'm, giving up on them and stuff like that. But I think we would do so much better in our world if we stopped like judging other people's decisions. And that's probably just good advice for everything, but especially when it comes to, if you're privileged enough and blessed enough to not have to go work and dig a ditch or not have to work on this, like you should have a strenuous life, in my opinion. Like, and you should be focusing on doing something great. And I don't care what it is. Maybe it's your $500,000 a year solopreneur project. Maybe it's your building $100 million company, but you should go after that. You shouldn't just be, judging others, I guess. Off my soapbox now.
No. No, I like the Theodore Roosevelt reference.
I was gonna like, do I crib it or do they get it? Like, I don't know if it's. I don't want to go down the strenuous life.
It's great. But we're kicking around in a strategy meeting last week. Basically, this idea of like, there's a lifestyle and there's a growth business, and it seems like often it can start as that lifestyle business because you are just like, man, it would just be fucking cool to make $100,000, and like that's all you're focused on. But then you get there and you're like, okay, it's not as satisfying as I thought it would be. Like I still need to fill my time with something. And now that I've taken care of, that lower rung of Maslow's hierarchy, now I want to make an impact and I want to help people and I need to find a way to like fill my time.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what happened with me was like, these answers beget more questions, which begets more answers. Right. And for me, it really took me realizing like, I can always get a job. Like I can always get a barista job. I can always get some sort of job that is probably not the job I want.
You could always get a job at Google, like you proved to yourself. So you're like, I can always go back to this at some point.
Really
like I've set my price in the market where now I can go out and take a risk.
Totally. But I also realized like money wasn't that important to me.
Ever?
Not as much anymore, if that makes sense. I think it was really important to me early on because like I didn't have any, right? And I don't have a lot right now, right? But like I took like, to give you context, like I cashed out my small 401k, which was like after taxes and everything was like 10 grand, right? Because they tax that heavily when you try to get it out. And like I took that and my savings is zero, right? And you just kind of I fell in love a little bit with like, oh, like I know what it is to be poor. I was poor growing up. I got a little taste of this when I was at the government and working at Google because they pay you way too much for what you do at Google. It's great, but it's like, it's definitely way too much. And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, like I know what that life, I know what, I get a taste of what that life could be, making 150 to 250 a year and like, just having a good life. But it was like, I wasn't going to be happy. Right. Like I was going to blow my brains out with that. Like, and so all of a sudden it was like, okay, like I know what it's like to be at zero. And so like, let's fall in love with it. Right. And for me, it's actually been a struggle to spend money because I still do have that like crazy mentality. Like I'm picking up my Tesla this week and it took months for me to agonize over, I don't know, what if the company goes under? And I'm looking at my savings account. My savings account is great, but it's like, I don't know. Is it a bad signal? Is it going to make me too bougie that I'm not going to like have the love of like the grind, right? But then I was like, listen, like I made zero in salary for the first 9 months and I was able to like, basically live on ramen essentially. Then I paid myself 30 grand a year because I was always dedicated to the build, right? And then finally, like I was like, screw it. I should make $100,000. This was like not that long ago. And I was like, and then I saved all my money and like was able to get back into a really good place, buy a house, get a nice car, these types of things. But it's, it's really that DNA that I think is really, really important.
Do you have like, so what does money like symbolize for you? Or like, how do you see it? Is it security? Is it
never
a tool?
been asked that question.
Is
it great?
Yeah, well, you're the pricing man. Let's dive into the way you evaluate it.
I don't think, I think it's security right now. And I think I'm slowly realizing it's a tool. Like from a business perspective, I realize it's a tool, right? But from a personal perspective, I think that I'm still in the security stage. Like if we're talking to, my partners they're older than I am, like one's over 40, one's late 30s, not saying that's old, but that's older. And they, they've been in the market, they got a lot of like mutual funds and stuff like that. I got like none of this, right? And they're like, well, why did you put it in the market? And I explain like how much I have in my savings account. And they're like, yeah, you need to like diversify that. That's way too much like cash, right? And I was like, yeah, but what if something happens, right? And they're just like, I'm still in this like security mindset. I think I'm slowly getting into like, I just moved to Salt Lake City. I was like, the market there is, it's hot, but it's like not as terrible as Boston, in terms of housing prices and things like that. So I'm like, oh, cool, I'll buy this house. And then it's like, oh, well, that was pretty easy. That was like relatively painless. Like I can afford maybe another down payment, another house, and that might be a rental property. So now it's like thinking a little bit more of a tool. I don't think I'm to a point where I'm going to be like an angel investor and all this other fun stuff, but it's like, I'm starting to get a better relationship with money than kind of the very blue collar concept that I had, if that makes sense.
Well, and it's interesting because it seems like you were very bullish doing it for your business. Like you were seeing like money is leverage. I will drain my savings account and put it into this business.
100%.
But then when it comes for personal use, there is a lot more of that like tightening up.
It's a weird, and I realize it's weird. And I come from like my dad and my grandfather like saved every dime, like, everything. Like we didn't have nice things. And they were able to, thankfully they were able to retire a little earlier than because they saved so much, right? They're still not spending anything, right? Yeah. Like they drive across the country rather than taking a flight because somehow the gas is going to be relatively cheaper. They don't even think about their time, right? But it's one of those things where I think that it's getting a better relationship personally with it. And I don't know, like, I don't think I'm ever, now I say this and like 5 years from now, I'm like buying a terrible like motorcycle or something like that. But like, I don't know if I'm ever going to be the guy who like, is flashy or anything like that. And I don't think that's bad or good. It's just like, I think it's more of, getting to a safe place with it where it's like not a hang up, right?
Knowing that you're protected from certain levels of chaos that could enter your life.
And I think that's a really big thing is like, I fall in love with that basically exactly what you said. Like, what are the expected values of certain outcomes and am I protected from it, right? And I think that's really interesting at people who like build wealth. Like that's where you start to spend that money is like, you might build a prepper shelter or something. I don't know if I'm going to go that far, but like, you start thinking about like, oh, I got my rainy day fund. Oh, now I have my retirement fund. Oh, now I have this. And like, and now it's like, hey, how do I build, for the future, which is investing, safe investments, not so safe investments, et cetera.
Any resources that have been helpful for that as you've been transitioning? Because I imagine there are a lot of people that have like started to build that successful business. They have 50,000, 100,000 in a savings account that they're just not doing anything with because they don't know what to do.
I mean, honestly, like I'm probably not the right guy to ask. Like, Ramit and other folks out there are pretty good. But I think that the one thing I would say is, and this is not good advice at all. I think I like finding tandem partners. So Facundo, our CPO, has no concept of money. Like absolutely no concept. He doesn't realize how much things cost, and that's okay because that's not like his focus. And I'm being a little like embellishing a little bit here. But like I remember we were hiring this entry level engineer, and this was like the first hire he made or was making when we were working together. And like I was like, oh yeah, so like what do you think about salary? And he did no research, and his number was like insane. And I was like, what? Like there's not even like anything in Google that says that that's what the number should be.
Like insane high?
Oh yeah, it was like $175,000. He's like, well, that's just what. And this is like a kid who like was right out of school, and like we weren't thrilled about, if that makes sense. And so it's just he just doesn't have a concept of how much things cost. So that's really helpful to have that type of person. So he's like encouraged me to be like, just buy the Tesla. Like stop. We're talking more about it than like we should, right? Yeah. And then he's like, you're only even getting the Model 3, right? Like it's all this like rationalization, right? But I think the other thing is like I think just finding frankly a good like life partner, like if that's your thing. Like for me, Jenny has been really good, not because we necessarily have different or the same opinions on money, but we have really good conversations about it, right? Like, what do we want out of this, right? Like, what's our, group DNA? And that helps guide some of these things.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So I don't really have any good resources.
No, this is good. Yeah. This is way off on a tangent, but I'm fascinated because I actually last night had a call with my friend who just got a Tesla Model 3, and so we were talking through that and like the use of money being mainly to get rid of the like big pain points in your life. So for him, he was like driving a shitty truck and he was just like, I'm so done with this and how expensive it is and all the repairs. And it's like, let me invest in something that I'm really going to enjoy and removes this big like nail I keep stepping on every day.
Well, I think when you're like, especially when you grow up in the Midwest, and I know that's like not just Midwesterners, it's like the amount of like even apologies I've been making in this conversation about buying a damn Tesla. And like when I got an Equinox membership for the first time, I was like, yeah, but I got a deal and they're going to do my laundry. And like, that's how it makes up. Like even with the Model 3, I'm like, yeah, but it's going to last like double the lifetime of a regular car. Like it's just one of those things where I think you got to get to a good relationship with money. And like, I think that just realizes like who you are with it. I know I'm like tight as hell. Right. That comes from like bootstrapping, but it also comes from like, for example, like with, building a company, like we're bootstrapped. And so, like the money, I didn't look at the money as mine. It was the money as the company's. And I would rather like put, have a really small salary. I was making 50 grand for a long time, even though we were pushing millions of dollars, right? Because it was very much like, if I can, spend that extra 25K, and this might be penny wise, pound foolish. If I can spend that extra 25K on that other hire or like whatever, like that's going to be better for us. Right. Yeah. So it's just thinking of what you're trying to optimize and like where you're sensitive and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. So back to the early days of Price Intelligently. That was a hell of a tangent. I loved it.
That's good.
But what was the like inflection point as you guys were building it? And you're like, oh, okay, this is actually going to be successful. Either we close this big client or we close a couple people.
It sounds a little smarmy, but it was very like, do it or
great
not.
Word, by
there
the
is
way.
no try. Like, smarmy is great. It was very much just like, it's got to be successful, right? Like, and I'm a grinder, like just in terms of my style, and so and what's funny is like Kagan was one of the people who like made me feel okay with that, and really just like realize myself, because Kagan was like, I was like, well, my best style is like, I go all out for like 2 weeks and I take like 2 days off. And I was like, oh, it's not healthy, blah, blah, blah. He's like, why not? Like, if that's how you work best, like, why not? Right. And he's one of those guys who's like very, open to like, doing what's best for you. Right. Yeah. But I think with the company, it was more of, we started getting traction. I sold in our first 6 months, like $150,000 worth of, software essentially.
Wow.
Mixed with service. Right. So that was the other thing, is we started off as a pure software product. And then all of a sudden, because pricing is kind of like one of these things that touches so many parts of the organization, if I give an exec any other problem besides pricing, they're like, yeah, I don't know what that is, but I'll go figure it out. You give them pricing and they're like all squirrely and they're like, I don't know what to do. And so they were just, a lot of our early customers were like, can you just come talk to us? Like, no, sorry. That's like services. VCs don't like services. And they're like, we'll pay you a lot of money. And we were like, okay, cool. Right. It wasn't exactly that blunt, but basically what ended up happening is we started coming to this thesis of like, oh, so the software plus service gives us the ability to sell like much higher lifetime value, like products, right?
Because of just the perceived value of having like hands-on.
Yeah, they look at us like consulting, which is problematic because we really don't like being compared to consultants, but like it just kind of happens. But we're charging like consulting money, but the optimization, the cost is very software-esque, right? So our gross margin 78% or higher, which is like software margins, right? But everyone's like, oh, like whenever we talk to investors, they're always like, well, this consulting business. And we're like, okay, like you're done. You don't even understand like the concept of what we're trying to do. So I think it started becoming that, and then just kind of getting the flywheel going of like building and selling. And then I think when it really started to take off was when we started this bigger thesis that I already explained of like, oh, it's more than just this pricing software. There's this ProfitWell metrics product, and there's this whole concept of subscription revenue automation. That's where it really started to take off, because we were like, oh, we can use this high LTV, high margin product to feed the software side of the business. And as long as we're disciplined, meaning we're not trying to take cash off the table that basically slows the growth of the business, and we're dedicated to having this bigger vision of this bigger company, we can kind of get the flywheel going. And I think we were incredibly, and still are incredibly insecure just about so many things. But it was one of those things, like when we launched ProfitWell, we thought we were geniuses, but like 4 weeks before we launched, Barometrics launched, like 4 weeks after ChartMogul launched, and there were a bunch of different products that came out. So we were insecure about that. But as soon as we started seeing that go up and up, like our flywheel of the ProfitWell product, which really took 18 months to get to a really good place, that's when we started being like, oh, like we can win this. Like we can win this part of the ecosystem. We can change this ecosystem. We can do it on our own terms, which is really cool.
What differentiated you guys from ChartMogul, Barometrics?
Accuracy.
Okay.
So we realized really early on, and free definitely helped as well. So we were gonna sell this product. We were gonna like put a price on it. What we realized, we did some of our pricing research, and this was like lucky that obviously we had that DNA. We discovered that basically no one likes paying for analytics products. We don't value them. We don't think they work as well as they should, or we want to pay a very small token amount. And the churn is terrible with analytics products, because people are like, oh, I just look at once a month. It must not be that valuable. Let's get rid of this like $1,000 product, right? And so that helped a lot. And the other thing that we discovered in that research is that if you were a company that is of a sizable, like of a size, right? Not a Johnny or Jane startup, but like someone who like cared, you like one of your top things was accuracy. Because if you're 5% off and you're a $10 million company, those are full-time hires that I can't hire because my numbers are off, let alone like all of the like reporting implications with your board or with the public, depending on if you're public. You're probably more than 10 million if you're public. But so we hunkered down, and it was a terrible 18 months because basically every day when we were trying to like get someone to use the product or we were doing outreach, it was, oh, well, Baremetrics has this graph. And we're like, yeah, but the graph is wrong. Like, do you get that the numbers are wrong? Yeah, but they have the graph, and I need the graph to report to so-and-so, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, right? And so, but once accuracy is really hard when it comes to analytics. And so once we got the accuracy to be in a fairly good, if not great place, that's when things started taking off. Because we would get these secondary users. They would go to ChartMogul. ChartMogul might maybe raise their price. They discover these accuracy issues. They maybe botch the support experience with it. They'd come to us and we would just give them phenomenal support for a free product. And they were like, cool, we're going to like hang out with you guys now. And they cancel their ChartMogul subscription. They're like, oh, well, we're saving this money now. Like, what's this other product you have? And they would like come and like go after the other product. But yeah, basically accuracy, the free thing helped a lot. The free thing hurts us with big companies. So now we've added like an enterprise, like it's almost like a fake tier.
Just because they want to pay for it?
Yeah, because they're like, well, you're going to hook up my financial data for free? What's the catch, right?
Yeah, you're stealing all my financial data.
Well, yeah, and most of the time, you know what's funny? They that's not what they think. They think it's just not great. And that's like the biggest thing. And you know, I always say this when we talk about freemium, we're like, freemium doesn't mean it's crappy. It can't be crappy to be freemium.
Yeah.
But they're mainly concerned with like, what about security? Are you going to take this seriously enough? Normally the small companies think we're selling their data, which we're like, we don't sell anyone's data, but like we wouldn't want to sell your data even if we did, right?
You don't have data to sell.
I know, that's what's always so interesting. Yeah, there's a huge misconception with freemium, you know, in the market. So
yeah, well, it's funny because that's a similar story of what happened to us, where we were for our subscription business, we were signed up to Baremetrics and ProfitWell. Yeah. One of the questions is how do you like prove to a customer that you're more accurate? Yeah,
that was tough. It took UX. So one, in the early days, we would have some dev resources, not consciously, but just reactively dedicated to proving them wrong. And what we would do is we'd pull these reports, or we'd have you pull a few customers and we'd show you, hey, like, and we couldn't necessarily tell you exactly what they were saying because we didn't have access to like their accounts. Sometimes people would invite us into their accounts, which was always great. But we would say, hey, this is how this user, like how we calculate this user. And it appears that they're saying this number and that's wrong. We don't know why it's wrong for them, like, but we know we're right? And we just prove them. And then the other thing we would do is over time, we started to develop like in ProfitWell, you can click any number, like basically any number, and it'll basically like, you know, Russian nesting doll. So you can click that number, then it goes to another number, you can click that number, and it goes all the way to the baseline, which is the customer section, where you can see like, oh, and if you click on that, it goes back into Stripe or whatever your billing system is.
So you can click on MRR, then it clicks into segments, then it clicks into the individual users, and then the plan that they're on.
Totally. And you can see like, oh, so these, and the other thing was when you click the number, sometimes it goes right to the customers tab, and it's like, these are all the customers that are in that number, right? And all the revenue that's in that number. And that helped a lot because it was one of those things where people could just kind of start to audit themselves. And it also gave, like, even if they weren't really going to audit it, because most people don't actually check the accuracy, it gave them just confidence because they were like, oh, this goes into that, this goes into that. Yeah, that seems right. But on we have a RevRec product, revenue recognition product, where like that it's gap reporting.
That's the accounting tool.
Yeah, and so that has to be like a higher level of accuracy. So we actually built that out of, hey, if we get this right, the other stuff will probably be almost perfect, right? And that one's been, you know, audited by big 4 firms and all that kind of fun stuff. And so that gave us a lot of confidence and also gave like our users a lot of confidence as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way you guys structured it with the freemium model, and then like one, you use price intelligently to figure out like, oh shit, we can't charge for this, or at least it would be a bad idea. So you're using your own product to solve your other product.
And what's really funny, so Baremetrics publishes all their financial data. Yeah. And our prediction of ARPU, LTV, churn, et cetera, were all like perfect, which is kind of crazy. Like, cause our algorithms weren't as good then as they are now.
Yeah.
But it was picture perfect. And we say it gave us 18 months where we knew before anyone else. They both tried free. I think free on Baremetrics kind of hurt their infrastructure. That was the other thing. Because we were free, we had to build really good infrastructure early because, you're trying to support and you need to make sure your costs are down.
Yeah.
I know for a long time, our costs, because he would tweet his infrastructure costs sometimes, like our costs were like a fifth of their costs, even though we had 10x more users.
What do you think made up the difference there?
It's just dedication to it. Like I think that when you're early on and you're getting paid for something, you might not necessarily care about your costs, right? It's not that they're necessarily bad engineers or anything. It's just like a difference in prioritization.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a big thing. And so ChartMogul came out with a free plan eventually, and we've kind of stopped looking at these guys as our competitors, if that makes sense, because like the vision's going beyond. Like we're going up market more and more and more. Yeah. ChartMogul is as well, but they're going up market in like a very different way. They look more like a traditional business intelligence tool, right? We look more as like a, this kind of revenue automation, or what we think is the next iteration of business intelligence. So at least that's how we think about it.
Well, that's the other piece that I think you guys did a really good job with, is how now you're bringing in all of these users. You can see all of their revenue data, like all of the things you would need to segment who you want your top customers to be. Yeah. Then instead of having to like go out after them with like Facebook ads and look at audience insights, you can look directly at their business, then know exactly who is in the right point to be upsold into either the retain or recognize.
Yep. So I need to be very careful here. So we don't look at anyone's data.
Okay.
Excuse
me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, correct me.
Make sure that's super clear so people don't get scared. So with permission, like if you're like, hey, I want help with pricing, hey, do you mind if I look at your ProfitWell account, because I can like evaluate certain things, right? Or if they want an audit. So we do these audits. We do have like high level data. So we algorithmically are like, hey, you seem to be bad at this. We don't say it like this, but like, you seem to be bad at this. We have something that helps with this.
Or on the retain one, because we actually upgraded to that, is like, it shows you how much you're losing every month from churn. Yep. And if you activated this is what we've seen you could on average do better at.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff in the product, and then we have some automated email stuff that goes, but we try to like, I just have to be very careful. We try to make sure, but we do study the data in aggregate too, which helps us a lot. But you're exactly right. It lowers our CAC. And it also, freemium, one of the biggest misconceptions is like, oh, well, that first month they have to convert, and that's how I evaluate free. And it's like, no, that's not the point. The freemium is like, you own the lead. You're nurturing the lead over time. We have plenty of people who, I think Sumo was like this, honestly. Like, you guys were with us for a long time, or at least were on the product. And then eventually you came, like 18 months in.
We were using, at least a year until we got retained, because we were using Baremetrics, whatever their recover, and then did a call with your team and decided to give it a shot and switch over. And then the pricing model is really slick too, where it's like you're only paying for the uplift you guys give us over the past 90 days, I think it is,
or up to 6 months, depending on what it is. So basically, and then that helps a lot with our sales process, because we're like, hey, right now you're recovering this much and you're using a competitor, that's fine. Up to that much is free. So if we don't beat them, it's free. And we would argue we have a better experience, but that's, up to debate, I'm sure. And so like, you get a better experience for free. But if we make you more money, then we'll take a cut of that money, and we have some tiers, as and stuff like that. So I think that, again, go back to leverage. Like, how do you best get the velocity and everything going?
Did you, or have you read Blue Ocean Strategy? Yeah. Because that seems to align with a lot of what you're saying, where it's like, you're looking at the like value points of all of your competitors, and then you're like, what if I did the opposite of that? Like, what if what they're doing nothing, I do a lot of that. What they're doing everything, I do none of that. And same thing with kind of the way you do your value-based pricing.
I think that's good. I don't know if I don't know if we've been that smart. I think I think we naturally did that, but I don't know if we like very consciously did it. Like we looked at, okay, like for the pricing side, anyone who signs up for a pricing audit gets one, right? Yeah. Pricing audit is basically, we get on the phone with you. If you're on ProfitWell, we look at some of your data, and we will go through, XYZ and tell you, hey, like, this is good, this is bad, you should focus here. Anyone. Even if you're a shitty lead, right? We still go like, you're not a shitty lead, you're just not a good lead, I guess I should say. We will still go through that. So that's like good support and evangelism, because like the Johnny or Jane startup, like most of them, there's occasionally like 1 out of 10. No, it's like 1 out of 100 who are just like complete jerks and like, oh, this is I didn't get this much or whatever. And you're like, well, it was free and we didn't have to get on the phone with you, right? But yeah, and so like support was a big thing. Like we were just like, hey, it's a free product, but we're gonna have great support. And there was just a bunch of things that kind of came in, and we still adjust some things. So like our live chat support there's gonna be a paywall that gets set up, if you're not on a paid product at some point, but we're still gonna provide you like probably 8 to 12 hour turnaround time even on email, right? We're just trying to like save some of the like knucklehead stuff that comes up.
Yeah.
But it's like finding those principles and really going into those principles of like what makes a great product and what makes a great experience. And, those fundamentals are hard. So it's one of those things that I don't think it's that our competitors don't want to do those things. I think it's just they're really hard and they may not prioritize them as much as we do.
Mm-hmm. So going into principles, another thing Neil sent my way is that one of the core values of ProfitWell is the most charitable interpretation principle.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is actually useful for anyone's life. When someone says something to you, you put that through a filter of like positive or negative, and it's a spectrum, right? So if you came up to me and you were screaming at me and you were swearing at me and you're just like, what the hell, Patrick, blah, 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 blah. I have a couple choices when you say that to me. Now, the easy choice is you're an ass, right? You're just being a jerk to me, right? But if we work together and like you're really upset and I know you a little bit, the harder choice, but probably the better choice is like, okay, you care about something a lot right now. You're worked up. My job is not to amplify you. My job is to help you and like maybe calm you down a little bit so we can talk through this, right? Now that's the hardest one. Like the easier one that we oftentimes make hard as humans is you say something and you use a word that I don't like, right? Or like you call me Patty or Pat or something and you don't know that I don't like when people call me that. But instead of like giving the most charitable interpretation, which is, oh, we don't really know each other that well, he doesn't know what that is. And maybe I'm just going to say like, hey, oh yeah, that's totally fine. I don't like being called Pat, by the way, it's Patrick, right? Instead of doing that, I just get pissed at you, right? Which you have no idea why I should be pissed at you, right? So the most charitable interpretation is basically when you're talking to someone and you're working with someone, you give them the benefit of the doubt and you assume they're smart and they might be right on whatever they're saying, right? So this comes up with, I'm sure you've had a bad day, when you're working with someone, someone comes to you and says something to you, or maybe even your partner or whatever it is, they come to you and they say something and you don't even really listen to them. You just kind of assume what they're saying. So you like get ahead of them and say they're wrong. And then at the end of the conversation where you've just had this big argument, you realize what they finally were saying and you're like, oh yeah, I do agree with that, right? You're trying to avoid that hour-long, like terrible conversation. So yeah, we have this big most charitable interpretation thing and it's like a little controversial, especially like in modern day right now, because like, let's say you use like a very derogatory word, like, maybe you didn't know, right? Like I'm from the Midwest. Like we're ignorant. We're not racist, but we're ignorant. Like sometimes we
information travels at different speeds.
Totally. And like I've been in Boston 10 years, so I have no excuse now. But like, it's one of those things where like sometimes like I might say something and like you should assume that I had positive intent, right? So that's a really big thing, and it's a really hard thing because there's a lot of folks that they want to like the yelling thing is we kind of say internally like if someone's yelling like you don't have to give them you should try, but like it's totally understandable if you don't give them a charitable interpretation. And obviously if someone's super positive, it's easy. It's really that gray area in between. You got to be given the most charitable interpretation because I don't know those trigger words that you have. I don't know like how you work best. And I want to give you and you should give me the benefit of the doubt that we're all trying to do the right thing. So it gets interesting. It gets really interesting. And it helps us avoid like, there was a situation where, just to give you some color to this, there was a situation where these two people were working together. This man gets off the phone. He was talking to someone, or they were on a conference call, and he turns to the woman at her office and goes, "Hey, what was that girl saying on the phone?" Use the word girl. Well, and this guy, nicest human being in the world, like very courteous, whatever. Well, the woman, like gets really upset that he said the word girl. It's really upset. Comes to HR. It's like, this is terrible. Blah blah blah. Like we support women. Blah blah blah. And I get involved and I'm like, I don't know. I'm not a woman. Is this an egregious mistake? Like I understand like, girl is more of a younger person. Woman's like an adult, right? But like going through that, and the hardest part was, hold on a second. Like what was this guy's intent? Maybe he didn't know. And you get into like, should she, the woman in this situation, should she have had to educate him? That's where you get a little dicey. But my coaching to her was, hey, and I talked to a bunch of women in the office and I was like, hey, because I tried to calibrate, like, is this a big deal or not? And they're like, I don't care. Like, I say girl all the time, right? Or whatever. But I went to that woman and I said, listen, this is clearly really important to you. And that's great, right? This is one of your like big values and one of your big priorities. I don't think he knows that. Like you should talk to him and he should be a little more sensitive. And his response should be, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize, one, I didn't realize that this was like a big deal, but two, I didn't realize you were really sensitive to it. I will try my best. And if for some reason I, mess up in the future, please correct me again, because it might take me a little bit, right? Because I use the word guys all the time, Midwest, so like it's kind of like they or them. And that has helped us really calibrate keeping the importance on building the company rather than like getting caught up in all these policies and things like that, which can get super dangerous to a culture.
Yeah. And just being able to approach that stuff, being if somebody does something like that and you're offended by it, it's like, how do I get curious or inquisitive about how this happened as opposed to just immediately offended by what happened?
Well, it opens up a lot of interesting questions, right? Because we lost someone we were interviewing. This is another good story. Like everyone was really excited about them. And there was something off from a work perspective, like scalability. They were going to be the first person in this new role. And so I was like, I don't know what's in it. So I ended up spending 8 hours with them, because whenever the team's like, yes, and everyone's really strong, especially some of the leaders, and I'm like, not, it just out of respect, like I need to like get to the root of it and like either get convinced or not and do my best to get convinced. Well, it fell apart because of a completely different reason. This came up naturally, and this is going to be a very abrupt way to like get to the end of this, but like, we were in this conversation and they asked me like, what if someone called, said the R word? I'm not going to say it, and a lot of people will say it, but I'm just, I think in posterity, this word's going to be like, not the N word, but up there. So I don't want to say it for the record, but what if someone called something the R word? And I was like, well, did they call someone that? No. They called like a report or something the R word? Yeah. I was like, okay, well, and they're in a public Slack channel? Yep. I was like, context really matters here. I'm not really sure. I think what I would do, just given the context we have, is I probably wouldn't do anything in the public channel, and I would go to them in their own private channel. I'd be like, hey, don't be a dumbass. You're smarter than that. Use a better word, right? They wanted me to fire that person, like on the spot, right? And it's one of those things where I then explained to them, I was like, hey, I totally respect that view. It's just not the culture we have here, so we might not be a best fit, right? And that's where the most charitable interpretation, I think it's lost to some folks, but I think it's gained us a lot of folks as well. And it's sadly our culture overall is very like, hey, you're either like extreme PC or you're extreme anti-PC, political correctness. And I think it's like most of us are just humans who want to do a good job with our lives and don't want to worry about either side of these things.
Yeah. How do we just show respect to everybody?
Yeah, just be respectful
not
and like focus on the mission, right?
Yeah.
And not be like, hey, I should be able to say the N word, and not be like, I need to worry about every little thing that I say. So yeah, it's interesting.
That's important. I appreciate you sharing those stories.
Oh no, it's going to get me in trouble. I guarantee you there's going to be someone.
Well, that's why I appreciate it.
Yeah, there's somebody pissed off is like, yeah, you should care about every single word that's said. And there's going to be some people who are like, that sounds like PC bullshit. Like, it's just really funny how being reasonable is now.
It's like, not the time for that.
Yeah, it's so weird, right? Yeah. Which, let's not get political.
But hey, for what it's worth, I stand with Patrick.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, transitioning. So you guys, you have a whole slew of brands and
it's going to be a hard transition, I feel. Yeah,
anyway, so you have products, conferences, and online content. I'm going to run through this because it just amazes me how much stuff you have going on. Stop me if I'm missing anything.
Okay.
So you got Price Intelligently, ProfitWell, Retain, and Recognized as the paid products, except for ProfitWell as the freemium. You have the Retain conference. Then for online content, you have Recur Now, you have ebooks, you have the pricing page teardown, Subscription 60, ProfitWell Report, and Protect the Hustle.
Yeah.
Am I missing anything?
There's probably a few things
There's
you're
probably
missing.
But there was in there.
Yeah. So basically so for those who don't know, we have these products. We have these 4 products. Free product, a hub and spoke model. Free product's a hub. The spokes are the paid products that do a couple of different things. And so you get people who come to the hub and then go to the spokes. You get some people who come into the spoke, then go to the hub and may go to the other products, right? It doesn't always work perfectly like that.
How does content fit in with that?
So this is what I'm about to say. So like content, content's always been a big driver for us. So like our marketing team up until like January of last year, January 2019 or so, was basically just me writing blog posts, right? And then January of 2018 or right about there, we started doing some video, and it was just like, hey, there's going to be a video for each blog post. And then I basically, going into 2018, I started realizing, okay, again, bootstrap, leverage. How are we going to, like, content's getting better. Everyone's doing better content. This whole 10x content thing, it used to be a secret, and now everyone's trying to do 10x content. We've always done like really beefy 1,300, 1,500, 2,000 word posts. So what ended up happening is we were just trying to find like, how do we best take advantage of one of our strengths, which is content, but do it in the context of a greater marketing team that's trying to scale. And so we started doing a bunch of research, and we discovered that the average B2B blog, the max average that you could expect, meaning if you have like a perfect week, the max average of touches that you would expect from any lead would be like 1.6 touches. So they read one of your blog posts, they come to another one via social media. Obviously, there's some people who do nothing, and there's a bunch of people who do like 10, 15 touches in a given week. We started looking at things like Bloomberg, The Skim, CNN, like different like actual media companies. And their max averages are typically like 7, 8, or 9, or somewhere in between there. Yeah, because if you think about it, like you go to a news site, whatever your news site is, you go there pretty consistently, right? Or if you are part of the Hustle or Skim or whatever it is, you just like keep getting that flow to come through. And so what was really kind of fascinating is we started looking at like, okay, well, if we can take 1.6 to 4, like you just look at the down market revenue, it's like we're buying yachts, right? It's going to be great, right? And we've been wrong about that statement before, but like
no yachts yet.
Yeah, no yachts yet. But when we started ProfitWell, we were like the metrics product. We were like, it's gonna be amazing. Everyone's gonna buy this. It's gonna be awesome. And then like everyone, like
let's give it away for
so
free.
Many competitors. Yeah. So anyway, so like we were looking at this, and basically the thesis started becoming like, oh, media networks, best in the world at gaining traffic, terrible at monetizing that traffic. SaaS companies, phenomenal at monetizing traffic, kind of okay at like getting traffic, right? And so we want to combine these two, and then it became, well, how do we launch a media network? Well, what are the constraints? Well, the constraints are like, how do we have multiple shows? Like, how do we have a show every day of the week? Because really what you're trying to do is I'm trying to email you 5 days a week and you not getting pissed at me. That's really what's trying to happen. So you're going to have some people who subscribe to everything, 5, 6 shows. You're going to have some people only subscribe to 1. And then that average basically goes up, right? And so what we ended up doing is we started looking at, okay, an ebook, a really good ebook, like not like a crappy like PDF of a blog post, time and materials costs about 10 grand, right? We started doing some calculations and we were like, we probably can do a season of a show for that much or less, right? Now, if you start calculating time of like you and I sitting here and like recording this, yeah, maybe it's over 10 grand, but this is part of your job, right? You know, it's not just the putting of it together, maybe contractors, those types of things. And so we started looking at, okay, what does it take to do one show? Okay, well, we started recording a show like once a week. We're like, why don't we just record 13 of these in a day? That's so much more efficient. We didn't, like, it took an hour. We literally calculated setup time, like filming time, recording time, editing time, all the different things. We were like, where can we cut this out? And we calculated for 13 episodes. Well, it's an hour per episode to set up and a half hour to tear down. That's 90 minutes times 13. Let's just do that once, right? Or twice if we split it over 2 days.
Brandon
right?
can speak to this.
Yeah.
He was in here like 3 hours before this,
right?
setting everything
because
up.
Because he wants to do a good job, and we're doing this in like one take theoretically, even though there's going to be editing. And so if he messes up the lighting, if he messes up the camera, like theoretically, you don't get me to, like, I'll come back if it gets messed up because I respect the game when you're doing media. But I think the thing to keep in mind is like, when you're sitting there and you're like, oh, like you start looking at the numbers, then it became about, so we started doing these seasons. So the first show we did was Pricing Page Teardown, which was kind of like a show. We put some concepts together. Then we were like, oh, we should have like a more of a generic podcast, but we wanted a generic podcast that was a little different. So that was Protect the Hustle. And then it became, okay, for us to be really good from the mechanical perspective, we need a daily show. And that opened up like an 18-month like can of worms, because it was like, if you think about, you know, if I take these 13 episodes and Brandon can do this where he like dumps the footage, theoretically he can hand it off to a contractor once he has a template for like the initial one, and that can save a bunch of money and time. But a daily show, you have to set up a contracting network, or you have to set up your own team in a very like fairly inexpensive way to just pump that out every day, right? And so that was Recur Now, used to be called Sub 60, you know, and that I think today we technically released it, and that's a daily show. Wow. I mean, it's been out there for 18 months, but we like officially were like, cool, it's in a good place. And it's kind of like the Hustle or Skim, but with, you know, B2B SaaS, it's B2B SaaS operators. We look at news, and it's a podcast, it's video, and it's also a written, so you can consume it however you want to consume it. So it's the same
content in different formats?
Yeah. So if you want to watch Abby's one of the hosts, you know, you can watch on YouTube, or you can watch on our Wistia pages. If you want to listen podcasts, if that's your thing on your commute, you can do that. Or if you just want to skim like the actual like email, and people kind of choose what they want.
Which ones have been most successful?
So that's a funny thing. And this is where, we can hopefully instill some knowledge so you don't have to spin your wheels on this for you guys. But I think that you have to pick what the primary thing is going to be. I think for Protect the Hustle, we were like audio first, right? We're still going to have the video like this. That's why I asked you, is this audio first? Is this video first? Because one, I guess, I'm vain, I guess. I don't know. Like, it doesn't matter, but it's more just like, it's a little bit different. There's some little bit differences when you're audio first versus video first, right? If this was video first, you might want to do a bunch of transitions and a bunch of other stuff. If it's audio first, you're going to care more about like the audio quality, the audio design of the show, those types of things. And the video just might be remnant content. So you chop it up for social or whatever it is to promote the actual podcast. So I think like Recur now, it's a little bit TBD. And then we kind of put it in the market. I have a feeling it's going to be podcast or it's going to be written first. And the video will be kind of like remnant content for social. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I was watching, again, Neil, he's getting plugged a bunch. I was watching his, what was it? It was like, how much does having a podcast like reduce your marketing costs?
Yeah.
And
ProfitWell report.
Yeah, that was a really interesting one. Basically showing that like you get, I think, something like a 25% reduction in customer acquisition cost if they come through like a rich medium like a video or a podcast.
Well, it's quality of content, right?
Yeah.
And a really well written blog post gets a certain group of people. There's just more people who like to listen to stuff, and there's more people, especially because our generation is starting to be like the buyers now. And we like to read, but probably not as blog post heavy as much anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, Neil, we're trying, and that's the other thing. So now that we have so many shows, we're trying to diversify the hosts. If I'm hosting everything, it's kind of like the Patrick show, which is like a little too much. So I did the first couple seasons of ProfitWell Report. Neil took over. That show's on hiatus right now just because the data collection and I was doing all the data analysis. We don't have a marketing data analyst right now. So that was tough. And then, we're getting other people involved in the other shows, which is good.
Yeah. Because that was one of the things. So Alona, who's the head of content here, that she did where all of our sales pages were just basically blog posts, and they always had been. And then she came in and she brought Brandon in, and they started producing videos to go over the software tools and kind of pitch them to people through video. That was like one of the most successful campaigns that we've done. And now we do it for all of our video. And it is interesting, kind of like the dichotomy of the people who still want to read versus the people that now just immediately dive into the video.
Yeah.
But now we're looking to expand into some branded content, like this type of stuff. So I'm curious what you think, like how you would kind of go about doing that, like moving into more branded content. How do you kind of like test and invest the channel? Or is it kind of like, hey, if you're already getting success with the things you're doing, you kind of just got to pick what you are going to be successful at again.
When you say branded content, tell me a little bit more.
So if we are going to do, say, more video series like this, like long form, or do we want to do a podcast?
So I think you have to pick. So what I encourage our media folks and our content folks to do, because a lot of them don't have like SaaS or like analytics experience, and that's totally fine. Our new social person, she was an analyst for the S&P for a long time. So we're like, fantastic. Like you're a diamond. We can't even find you anywhere. Right. But I think it's like, encourage them to look at formats. So they love sports. Cool. Watch formats. Like what shows are you watching? You're watching ESPN. You're watching, I can't remember that one where they have like 4 people. There's a host who gives them scores when they mention something, like 3 points, 4 points, like they give them points, and their points are kind of fake. Then there's Gruden's boot camp, right? Where like he sits down with the new quarterbacks and they basically look at plays and look at tape or whatever. If they're into like, TMZ or those types of television, like what are the different shows on E? There's like a Talk Soup Tile. There's a bunch of other stuff. Like look at formats. And then what you want to do, and we learned this later, kind of the hard way, is that basically you want to figure out, you want to show for a particular problem or a particular segment. So pricing page teardown is very much like, if you're interested in pricing or like tangentially interesting, this is interesting. If you're not, it is terrible, right? Like, it's like, why are they talking about this, right? Recur now, it used to be very general subscriptions. And we found out that like the content that a D2C subscription, like a box of the month or a media subscription, those operators, they don't really look at a lot of B2B SaaS content, right? And vice versa. So we were like, we have to like hone this in to specifically what it's going to be, right? So I think it's just like classic marketing where the way you come up with shows is like, oh, what's an interesting concept, like the actual like format for the show, and then who's the target, right? And it's very classic marketing. And I think you should have multiple shows, right? For us, right now we're working on a churn show. So a show that's related to churn for the box of the month community, right? that show might have 5,000 viewers a month. That's success. That's amazing, right? Like right now, pricing-based teardown, I don't know why, but like there's 35,000 people who watch that a month, right? It's not like 100,000, visit blog post, but it's like those people are the ones that we're selling to. So it's great, right?
And all that content lives on site. You guys don't put it on YouTube?
Well, we have a drip on YouTube. We've kind of we've been so focused on the mechanization of trying to figure this out that our distribution has basically been an afterthought, right? And now we're just literally this quarter, we're hiring the right people to basically focus on distribution. And we've been working with like some good SEO folks for about a year. So there's like a bunch of that type of stuff. So YouTube was kind of a back burner. Like all of the like subscribers we've gotten have just been like remnant, like just by posting every day something. And now we're probably going to have like a strategy, right? Because YouTube content is very different than like long form video content, which is very different content than works on LinkedIn or Twitter, right? So that's where it comes down to, like, you have to have a strategy of like, here's who we're going after and the problems the shows are associated with. And sometimes it can just be like entertaining, educational, which is kind of like this show. That's what Protect the Hustle really is. Yeah. But you should still understand who the audience is as specific as humanly possible. And then so on and so forth. You kind of like have that show, and then we break it up for the social channels, or we're going to do a lot more of that. And then you start attracting more and more of those people.
That's awesome. Yeah. So do you have any predictions of where kind of all this media is going for 2020 and beyond, and how it's going to work for brands versus like we've seen it work for individuals like Rogan or Tim Ferriss, where they have kind of like that brand, versus how do you do it? I guess how do you communicate as a brand that people want to connect with? Because like you're obviously like a very big face of ProfitWell. Sure. And I imagine people connect with you a lot. But how do you then tie that back in the brand? Does it make sense to have a person at the front of it versus the company at the front of it?
I am a big believer that a person can anchor things, but you need multiple anchors. So what this year is really about, and we're probably not going to be able to develop it as much until the end of the year, is that any new shows, I'm basically just not a part of. I'm just an exec producer. I help push them. I help try to figure it out, and I help coach the new hosts. And I'm not like, Rogan or like, Kelly Ripa or anything like that, but it's like one of those things where I'm here to basically be like, cool. So like, this is how like, cause it reminds me back of like peer coaching back in like the debate and speech days, because it's a lot of like, hey, you just need to, you don't realize like when you slouch, you look like you have low energy, right? Like just stuff like that. Right. So I'm doing a lot of that. And I think by the end of the year, it's like, how can we build the profiles of a couple of other people? So it's a network. And I think the biggest prediction is you will, and you're seeing this so much now, which is great. And we were really excited that we were like, one of the first, if not the first, to really do this in B2B SaaS, which is like, you're going to see more networks, right? Because it's just a function of more product and a function of more content. You just have to get better. And then like episodic content is what a lot of people are. So you're going to, just start off, just have a podcast, just start off with a podcast, get your feet wet, expand that to video, expand that to other places. And like you eventually will have more series basically. We're actually putting it together. We're finally getting the website out of like, you'll go there and it'll like, oh, this looks like Hulu, right? It looks like an actual network.
That's awesome.
Rather than just like a generic like blog, if that makes sense.
Well, once you guys roll out media intelligently, we will be your beta testers for that.
Well, we've thought of like, there's some funny like thoughts, when you're dreaming a little bit of like, we could probably have like, kind of like some people have studios where they, will do other content. We're starting to do a lot more partner content. So like with one of our, we launched this show, RevOps and Hops. RevOps is like this new revenue operations. It's like this new function. Basically, you're combining marketing, sales, and customer success operations under one group. But with Chargeify, that was like a big thing that we did. And like the partner stuff's interesting because for us, we're like, hey, we have all this expertise in like doing video, audio, et cetera. You want to learn that and you want some of that. And we also would like, you to invite all of your customers to this, that type of thing. And so it's like a win-win-win, which is really great. And also we're able to like talk about, the thing that they want to really talk about. Yeah.
It's very cool. Last one before we transition into the audience questions is what are your goals for the year? Either personal or professional? Kind of what's 2020? What's the ideal version look like for you?
The first year we're doing company level OKRs.
Oh, interesting.
So those are really upfront.
What are they?
We've always done like goals, but we haven't done as much like company wide. So there's 4 of them, and this is going to be embarrassing. One of them is very focused on hiring. We went from 40 to 80 last year. I don't think we need to go to like 160 this year. Please, for the love of God, no, unless it's all good. Like, and so I think, but we realized that we had some like frailties with our recruiting and like all that kind of fun stuff. Just like getting the right people. If we kind of reach the stage, and you kind of have that a little bit here, where it's like, oh, if you lose that one person, they're a single department, and then it kind of affects all the departments around it, and you need to find a new person for that role as soon as possible, right? And we just didn't have that DNA quite there, so we're trying to get that DNA. We also need like execs or like senior folks, director on up. We just don't have a lot of those, and we haven't developed some DNA in recruiting them.
At what point did you start hiring those roles?
Like in general?
Yeah. Like,
I mean, we've always wanted to hire those roles, and like technically, you know, Peter and Facundo are technically those types of hires. Yeah. But I think that I think it's one of those things that we have never actively hired for those types of roles. Like maybe one or two we've actively hired for, and we've been somewhat successful. But I think it was more luck than actual like skill. So now we're like, what does an executive level search or a director level search actually look like? Let's put a slate together. Let's do this process, a bunch of coffees and lunches and all that kind of fun stuff, versus just kind of this reactive, like, oh, I hope they apply, because those types of people never apply for jobs, right? So yeah, that's the big thing. So there's an OKR center around that type of stuff. We have a big, it's early enough in the year, I feel comfortable saying this because it's coming soon. Basically, we have this big initiative for getting ProfitWell data everywhere. So imagine, you know, our biggest strength has been the accuracy and the cleanliness of the data. So taking that data and being able to, like, you know, maybe you don't even want to use the reporting, but you want clean revenue data in HubSpot. You want it in Salesforce. You want it in your ERP. You want it in wherever it is. We're totally fine being that middleware between everything else with clean revenue data. And so there's a bunch of, you know, key results under that. And then,
so would that just be like direct integrations or a Zapier integration?
Basically, no, not Zapier. Cause Zapier is great, but it doesn't give you the fidelity that you need for some of this stuff. So if I'm like, hey, Fortune 50 company, we're going to clean your data and put it in places, they don't want to use Zapier for that. They want like a direct connection because they want that control, and like rate limiting and all that kind of fun stuff. And so that's a big initiative. And then really this whole year, like the bulk of the year, from a product perspective, is being spent on our retention products. So Retain is going to start, you may have received an email about this, is going to start going after active churn, not just delinquent churn or credit card failures. And that's basically what we looked at. Was, if you think about retention, there's a little bit of a spectrum where there's a bunch of things where if like your product sucks, you're getting the wrong kind of customer, like no tactics will solve that, right? But about 40% of your churn, and there's, you know, some ways we've calculated that, is mechanical. So part of that is going to be your credit card delinquencies, which we're really good at this point. Part of that's going to be re-engagement campaigns. Part of that's going to be optimizing your term. And we can do that with algorithms better than anyone can do with humans, right? Because we're sitting on 20% of the market's data, which feeds those algorithms, right? So that's a really big thing. And so you're going to start seeing inside ProfitWell, we're going to have health scores that have like a certain level of, you know, confidence. We're going to start seeing, you know, different, like more retention-based reporting. And then with Retain, the actual paid product, you're going to see a bunch of stuff around, I don't know what we're going to call it yet, but like customer success automation. So you still might need like a Gainsight or some of these other products. We're not going to replace those. But you can turn this on and we'll automatically just recover churn or prevent churn depending on what it looks like.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the execution of it is going to be tough. And we're finding that like some of the nudges or the experiments that we think will work aren't working. And then some are working way too well. And so it's one of those things that it's going to take some time to package this all together. So I think what's really going to happen is like, we're just going to keep adding these features to, and it's all going to be under Retain. And then we'll probably like rebrand Retain, not change the name, but just rebrand it from, you know, oh, we take care of your credit card failures to, oh, we reduce your churn automatically. That kind of a thing.
Do you guys have any ARR or revenue goals?
What's really funny is that we, for the first time last year, we did like, we thought really good projections. And we thought we were like really good at like calculating what we were going to be at. And we were terrible, ironically, given what we do. It's really hard to like project because we didn't have a lot of predictability with our like sales funnel. You know, things were growing and things were good, but we just didn't have a ton of like fidelity in that data. And what I'm talking about is like, when you don't have a marketing team until early last year, and you're like, cool, we're going to hire a bunch of like these people, like, oh yeah, they're not going to need to ramp, right? And of course they need to ramp, right? Yeah. And so it was a lot of things. So what we did this year is we're doing quarterly based revenue projections.
Okay.
And basically the hope is by the end of Q2, if not by the end of Q3, we'll have enough predictability that we can then do really good 12-month projections. But we didn't want to set up our team for, because we kind of got in front of the room and we're like, we're going to grow this much. And the number was big. And then we were like, oh shit. Like, we didn't hire those people in January. There's no way in hell this compounds that much by December, right? Yeah. Last year was a big learning year and we grew and everything, but it was one of those things where we definitely misaligned the expectations of the team. And so we wanted to avoid that. And so we're doing quarterly basis right now.
And what are some of those marketing pushes that you think is going to bring you there?
I actually don't think it's essentially marketing. I think the content is going to continue to help. Events we're blowing out. We do really well with events now. I think what it's really going to take is also like we do ABM, account-based marketing with our sales. So our like BDRs, they're not BDRs, they're more specialists, we call them, because they're not just like, hey, let me send 500 emails and see what happens. They do a lot more like deep campaigns and a lot more strategy behind it. But
that would be the price intelligently mostly?
No, for retain as well.
Oh, okay.
So retain and price intelligent, those are our two foci. And then recognized we're going to start doing some more like outreach. We don't have a sales team at all for that product right now. So probably by the end of the year, we'll have a sales team for that product. But it's one of those things, honestly, it's just doing some of the fundamentals that we just have never done.
Yeah.
And thankfully there's really good playbooks for the fundamentals, versus like trying to reinvent something, which we were trying to do with our content, which, you got to do reinvention of things, but you also have to do some of the basics to kind of keep scaling and growing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive into some of these audience questions.
Let's do it.
Putting them off long enough. All right, Sarah Beth wants to know your thoughts on creating entertaining B2B content or B2B shows in 2020. What are his tips and learnings? I know we went over this a bit. But...
Yeah, entertaining B2B content. It's a great question. I think, so here's the thing. A lot of people, they look at like a Joe Rogan or they look at, I don't know, I can't think of someone who's very charismatic, like H3H3, Philip DeFranco, some of these folks that are just more general media, and they go, oh, we need a host like that. And then they look at their C team or their marketing team, and no one is that charismatic, right? And that's fine, right? Like, and there's some hosts that they think they're charismatic and they're very much not charismatic, and that gets really problematic for a lot of reasons, right? What you need to do is the format is your friend. And what I mean by that, so what we've been doing with Pricing-Based Teardown, it was literally like, just turn the camera on and I'll just go, right? And Peter will be there and he'll jump in here and there or whatever. But I'm trying to fire myself from that show. So in order to like make it, the first time we tried to film it, it was terrible because the people just weren't, like they weren't as, charismatic in the pricing way that I can be. And so it was like, okay, we need more structure around the show. So the structure is your friend and the format's your friend. And so that allows also like guys like Brandon to like cut in the right places rather than just having like a one take type of show, right? Here, you're going to bring on guests who are like, they're probably all used to getting interviewed and like, they're a little bit more like, notice how like, I'm not talking really slowly. Like I got some levels here.
Yeah,
like
not one word answers.
Yeah. Like I'm like, yes, I understand there's an element of education. There's an element of like infotainment to this as well. But the structure is your friend. And so really what you need to do is find those formats and then shape that format around whatever you're trying to do.
Yeah. So getting that freedom through the constraints.
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, Alex, CEO of StandUply, which is a partner product that we've worked with. Ask him how many marketing channels do they or other SaaS businesses have that bring 80% of customers? Is it only one working channel, as Peter Thiel advises, or is it different from company to company?
That's really interesting. It's like a deep question.
Yeah.
I think that for us, I guess you could argue content is like our main marketing channel, but like that's layered on with events as well. If you look at events and content, and partially you'd have to throw part of our BDR team into there because they do a ton of content. Yeah, that's definitely like 80%, if not 99% of what we do.
Yeah.
I think that like it's kind of like, we do demand gen, we do ads, but they're a part of the overall strategy. I think that's the case. I don't know if I have a really strong answer other than that. I can answer for us. I know that like other companies, they're typically doing about 12 to 13 different marketing channels, but most of those channels are part of a cohesive strategy. So for us, like ABM is how we do like our sales, but ABM involves content, demand gen, events, and a couple of other things, would you count that as 4 or 5 channels, or would you count that as one, right? Or one strategy, right? So that might be something to kind of push back. Hopefully that's helpful for stand-up.
Yeah, because for you, I guess, do you look at your content team as a single channel? Because you guys have so many different...
Not really. I mean, like content is like, content's a strategy, but there's multiple channels within that, right? There's social. Most of our stuff comes from the blog as well. So, or the actual website. So yeah, it's a super tough now. I think a lot of the stuff's blending. Yeah. Like it used to be you just like, hey, let's set up AdWords, right? And then it's like AdWords and display ads. And now it's like a whole cohesive strategy. And like, I think it's really hard to be like, oh, one channel works, one channel doesn't, for at least a business like ours. But we're going after like mid-market enterprise type companies. We get plenty of Johnny and Jane startups use the free product, but they're not necessarily our target customer.
Well, and it can be that surround sound too, where like we notice when we reduce Facebook ads, organic traffic goes down because people will like see it on Facebook, then Google it, then come back to it later. And so it's it all just works in that, stadium effect.
Totally.
What are some of the lessons you've learned as a leader?
Ego's the enemy. I know that's the name of a book, but
Ryan Holiday, his picture's on the wall over there.
Is he over here? Yeah, of course he is. No, seriously, like that's the biggest thing. I think hopefully you've heard like, oh, I was wrong, made fun of myself with hubris, these types of things. I think it's incredibly difficult to build a company if you don't grow as a leader. Like you see this all the time. There's very like, I call them like dictator-led companies where it's just like, I'm in charge. I'm going to micromanage everything. Everything has to be approved by me. That's not going to work. In order for that not to work, you have to be comfortable giving stuff up. And most entrepreneurs, they're control freaks in a good way, right?
And that's why they're good at starting.
That's why they're good at starting, right?
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where you have to like kill that. In order to kill that, you have to be like, oh, I'm good at this or I'm not good at this. And part of it is like you have to hire people who are better than you at stuff. And that takes killing the ego, because it's like I have to get stuff done. And getting stuff done is not me doing it. It's like other people doing it and us like working as a team.
Yeah. Awesome. So this is from Ben Dell, who is the founder of Missing Letter, Hey Summit, Help Shelf, and Onboard Flow. You're going to be on his summit on onboarding, which is going to be cool.
I was supposed to do that last year, but emails got crossed.
Ben's great. I actually did a webinar with him this morning on Onboard Flow. Cool. So Ben wants to ask, how does Patrick think about freemium for B2B companies in 2020?
Yeah. I used to talk crap about freemium and said it was terrible. So again, humble and ego. So freemium is in everyone's future. It just is. And there's a lot of like, people who are going to like shit post me on that, which is fine. The reason is because if you think about CAC is up about 85% over the past 5 years. And that's just blended of all channels. Yes, some channels are up less than that. Freemium is actually up, I think, only like 40%. And the reason for this is that while that's happening, the value of stuff has gone down. Used to be you could put a login screen on a database and you were looked at as a god, like, right? Because it was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Right now, if it doesn't have good support, good design, like I'm not even interested, right? Yeah. So basically, because there's so much density happening with content and all these other things, the path of least resistance is going to become, oh, we should have a free product, right? And that, I don't know if it's probably not going to be part of the marketing team, but it'll be part of the product team. But it's one of those things where basically what's going to happen is that's going to be the path of least resistance or the path of lowest CAC in order to kind of build your funnel. And you're going to nurture those leads. And all of a sudden it's going to be one of those things where you might have a product that's free that has nothing to do with your paid product, but it attracts the people that you're trying to go after, right? But yeah, that's the future of it. And the biggest thing you have to think about is freemium is an acquisition model. It's not a revenue model. So you have to think about it like a premium ebook. Like it's just leads. Yeah. Most successful freemium folks, they typically start freemium about 3-4 years into their businesses because they understand how to convert a lead at that point. And now it's just how do we open up the funnel or the flywheel, whatever we're calling it these days.
The growth engine.
The engine. How do they open up more fuel? I don't know. How do they open up more leads to basically come in? And freemium is one of the most effective ways to do that. But most people get it wrong. Most people start too early and then it gets a lot of noise. And then most people, they don't have someone who's focused on the precipice between free and paid. Which is really problematic.
It seems like they'll miss the emium part of it.
Yeah. That's good. I like that.
That is the end of the questions that we had. Cool, is there anything else that you wanted to go over? I appreciate you taking this much time to go through all this.
No, it's cool, man. I don't have anything in particular. I think if anyone needs any help or has any questions, I'm pc@profitwell.com, or I'm just Patrick Campbell on LinkedIn. But yeah, thanks for having me. I'm more than happy to help with anything else.
Thanks for coming in. If anybody is running a subscription business, going to be running a subscription business, check out ProfitWell. We've been using it for over 2 years. We've loved it. ProfitWell.com.
Thanks, man.
Patrick, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thank y'all. See you soon.